Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. This is the second of a series of videos in which I review and discuss each and every Warlord and signature squad we've seen released thus far, and today I'll be focusing on the highs and lows of the first of our Astra Militarum faction Warlords. Keep in mind that although at this point we've seen the release of each and every expansion of the Warlord cycle of war packs, in this video I'll only be assessing the card synergy contained within the confines of the core set, although I'll eventually be covering the other core warlords, the non-signature cards of the core set, and eventually our various war packs in later videos. But, diving straight on in, let's see what the first Imperial Guard Warlord has to offer. He is a unique warlord named Colonel Straken, with the traits Soldier and Catachan. His starting hand size is 7, his starting resource tokens are also 7, he has 2 attack value, 6 hit points, and an ability that reads each other soldier or warrior unit you control at this planet gets +1 attack value. But before I discuss Straken's specifics, I'll just note that on his bloodied side, his text box is essentially blank. He retains his 2 attack value, but his hit points drop to 5, at that point making him a relatively squishy and vulnerable target for your enemy. So, one of the very first things that jumps out about this warlord is that relative to the other core set warlords, although his hit point value isn't on the higher end, he does have a pretty reasonable starting attack value, although it's very important to note that his ability does not actually affect himself. It only affects other army and token units that you control and happen to have at his current planet. What is nice about his ability is that in playing this faction, you're likely to see quite a few Guardsman tokens over the course of the game, and they're a 1/2 card with the Soldier trait, so when they happen to be at the same planet as Colonel Straken, they're boosted up to a 2/2 attacker, and even though there are only a handful of different card effects that can get those Guardsmen into play, it is nevertheless possible to have quite a few of them, and if you can manage to get a multitude of those into play, they synergize very well with something that the Astra Militarum faction specializes in, which is having a lot of low-cost, low-attack value units that can nevertheless gang up against opponents, swarm them down, eventually destroy them, and take advantage of myriad different win this card or win this token leaves play or sacrifice type effects. Because his ability only influences army units and tokens that happen to be at the same planet as him, and because the Astra Militarum tend to deploy a large number of units to fight at the same planet, so wherever you might be anticipating a battle, it makes sense to have a lot of units there, so like I mentioned before, they can gang up against much larger enemy units. One of the drawbacks with that is it does become relatively straightforward and simple for your opponent to telegraph or predict where you might be committing Colonel Straken each and every turn. Unlike a faction like the Space Marines, the Imperial Guard don't have nearly as many tricks to dump units onto the table in a less predictable manner. Although they do have some, in general, players probably aren't going to be taken by surprise nearly as often. In further assessing the value of his ability, however, in the core set we see a grand total of 13 different army units that you might see in an Imperial Guard deck that are eligible to receive that +1 attack bonus by merit of being a soldier or warrior, and certainly the more of these units you can have sitting at the same planet as he is, you'll see all the more benefit from that attack bolstering effect. What is compelling about this warlord is that as we see additional cards released, Throughout the course of the Warlord cycle, we're going to end up seeing 9 more army units that are eligible for that effect, that could see play in an Astra Militarum deck, and as this living card game continues to grow and expand, specific effects in particular work extraordinarily well with Straken. Specifically, any kind of multiplicative effect. One unit in specific that comes to mind is the Orc Army unit Tank Busta Bombas, a 3 attack value unit that receives +1 attack power from Straken, which doesn't just bring it to a total attack power of 4, but when it attacks an enemy vehicle, you double that value of 4 to a whopping 8. Which, with the exception of flying units, is capable of one-hit killing any single vehicle we've seen in the core set. Although vehicle army units in particular might not be the most common sight on the field of battle, another strong army unit to deploy alongside Colonel Straken would be the Orc Goth Boys, which, when they happen to be at the first planet for a mere 1 resource, could nevertheless be attacking for a very respectable 4. Again, as is sort of the theme with Straken, this is fairly easy for your opponent to predict, but you can nevertheless conjure up a significant amount of attack power, and coupled with a number of other effects I'll discuss in this video, you could potentially deal out some serious damage to your opponent. As you're unlikely to be deploying Colonel Straken to a planet where he'll end up fighting any battles alone, there's a small handful of cards that synergize relatively well with this Warlord. One of these is the event Preemptive Barrage, which can give him and up to 2 other army units at the same planet as him ranged, so that even if you don't get the opportunity to take advantage of initiative, you might be able to strike in that ranged skirmish and dispatch or destroy some enemy units before they can whittle down your forces or potentially wound or bloody your Warlord. For the cost of 1 resource, that can have a potentially devastating effect, and considering just how powerful Colonel Straken's ability can be, in that it affects a lot of other units on the board, your opponent is probably going to be trying to concentrate as much firepower on bringing him down as possible. And for that reason, the support Rockcrete Bunker can add some serious survivability to him, because even though it's a significant resource investment and that support can only absorb 1 damage per round until it reaches that cap of 4, it allows the Astra Militarum player to be a little bit more reckless or carefree in their deployment and to take a few more risks. One of Straken's signature cards I'll be covering later in this video allows his controller to be much more reckless, but those bunkers can nevertheless prevent Straken from dying a slow death of accumulating a point of damage here, a point of damage there over time, or, combined with shield cards, can allow him to nevertheless withstand a significant and powerful attack. And last but not least, I'll just mention the zero-cost event Suppressive Fire, which although it requires you to exhaust your Warlord to use, it does not deactivate his ability, and it allows you to exhaust a target non-Warlord unit at the same planet. So if your opponent has invested heavily his or her resources into 1 or more large units, you could potentially muster your Imperial Guard forces to bring down that exhausted adversary before it gets a chance to attack you, or before it gets a chance to potentially bloody your Warlord, just because 1 single large blow might end up costing you his ability and a hell of a lot of attack power over the course of the game. But on to the first of Colonel Straken's signature squad, which is the 2-cost army unit Straken's Command Squad, with 1 command icon, an attack value of 2, and 2 hit points. It has the Soldier trait, which means it benefits from Colonel Straken's ability, as well as the Catachan trait, and its text box reads, Interrupt. When this unit leaves play, put a Guardsman token into play at the same planet. And just to remind you, those are 1 attack, 2 hit point, Soldier trait units that can also benefit from Straken's ability. This army unit is relatively cheap to deploy. It has a command icon that allows you to potentially win command struggles in the early game. It can bully your opponent's rogue traders, void pirates, or other low-cost command-focused units, like the Tau Vashya Trailblazer. But if it ends up fighting a battle at the same planet as Colonel Straken, it reaches a respectable 3 attack value. And considering that if it happens to be destroyed, it puts a guardsman token into play, even though that token doesn't end up having any command icons, it nevertheless manages to help you maintain a presence on different planets, and since that guardsman token doesn't interplay exhausted, it could potentially allow you to get in another attack and to keep on damaging your enemy's units, potentially winning battles. In taking a closer look at this unit's ability, I think it's of the utmost importance that players do not, under any circumstance, underestimate just how potentially powerful this unit replacing itself with a token can be, particularly if the Astra Militarum player has initiative, but also if they happen to be in a conflict or battle with a very small or limited number of units. For example, let's say that you attack your opponent with Straken's command squad for 2 or 3 damage, and he or she responds in turn with an attack that kills that command squad. That token enters play, and it also gets to attack, whether it's for 1 or 2 points of damage, and even if that triggers a new combat round, if you have initiative, if your token is the only unit on the planet, it gets to attack once again, which helps you to add more and more damage onto your opponent. And even if there happen to be more units involved, and it's a bigger scale battle, a much larger conflict, you're still putting additional bodies on the field, soaking additional enemy attacks, and if they've invested heavily in hard-hitting, expensive units, there really is no better feeling than seeing an opponent's 5 or 6 cost unit investing its combat action in destroying a simple 2 hit point token unit. Although this unit seems relatively straightforward, there's nevertheless a potent amount of synergistic cards available for the Astra Militarum to choose from within the core set alone, and still more throughout the course of the Warlord cycle, and I'm sure that we're going to be seeing plenty more beyond. One specific card that works particularly well with Straken's command squad is the Elysian Assault Team, so that if the command squad happens to leave play, that not only allows you to replace it with a guardsman token, but it also allows you to put a 2-attack, 1-hit point soldier trait army unit into play from your hand, which, if you happen to have Colonel Straken at that planet, also benefits from that attack bolstering ability. Similarly, if Straken's command squad and or that Elysian assault team leaves play, Cadian mortar squad will become readied, and if you happen to have Captain Marcus sitting at that same planet, an exhausted Straken's command squad might just be the perfect target to trigger his ability, so that you can not only attack, but sacrifice that unit, exhaust a non-warlord unit, put that guardsman token into play, and potentially trigger any number of other effects. Also worth mentioning, as with any Astra Militarum unit, the support Imperial Bunker allows you to lower its cost, and there are a number of different attachments you might want to consider sticking to it, namely the Orc Rocket Launcher, if you want to give it a ranged attack value of potentially 3 when deployed at the same planet as Straken, or maybe the Godwin Pattern Bolter to just give it another single point of attack power. Having that additional hit point on this unit probably isn't particularly useful, but if you're deploying this simply for staying power, always remember that it replaces itself with another unit. You nevertheless might want to benefit from that slight HP boost, and for a much more significant effect, you're also welcome to deploy hostile environment gear, which would bring its hit points up to a very respectable 6, and although it's a relatively significant resource investment at that point, again, if it happens to be following Colonel Straken, it's nevertheless a reasonably hard-hitting unit. We've covered other cards that can give it ranged. If you leverage initiative in your favor, this could potentially be a pretty powerful, low-cost army unit. Considering, too, that you'll have 4 copies of this in your deck, it just makes it all the better that it's a very worthwhile army unit to play. Last but not least, and before I move on to cover non-unit cards, I'll just mention that if you're looking to bolster an attacking unit's attack value, there's scarcely a better card than Catachan Outpost, a 2-cost support that as a combat action can once per phase, per copy of that support, give either Colonel Straken or his command squad an enormous +2 attack value, albeit only for their very next attack that phase. It's worth noting that this effect can't be combined with an event that I'll be covering later on in this video, but if you're looking to seriously hurt your opponent, look no further than this incredible card. Next up, in Straken's signature squad, we have the 1-cost attachment Straken's Cunning, with 3 shield icons, the skill, trait, and the text attached to an army unit. Attached unit gets +1 attack and interrupt. When attached unit leaves play, draw 3 cards. So, important to note, it has to be affixed to an army unit, which means Straken himself is not an eligible target. If you choose not to use this for that monumental shield value, perhaps to spare your Warlord from being bloodied by some unexpectedly high-value attack, for a very small investment, this nevertheless provides a small attack boost that can make all the difference. It could encourage your opponent to waste shield icons. It could make the difference between the life and death of a more powerful enemy unit. It could enhance the harassment capability of a Rattling Deadeye, or simply, if combined with your Warlord's attack boost, could make any one individual attacking unit all the stronger. I don't necessarily think this is a card you have to put too much thought into whether or not you want to play or where you want to play it, specifically because of that interruptibility. So for a very small investment of resources, you end up drawing 3 cards, which can be absolutely fantastic. And considering that the Imperial Guard benefit from having a large number of smaller resource cost units, investing just a little bit of resource into drawing a large volume of cards, only to start filling the table with more and more units, supports, or just having a wider range of event cards to draw from, can provide an enormous benefit. So even though this is a 1-copy card, only taking up 1 slot in your signature squad and deck, I don't think there's ever a bad time to draw this attachment, and clearly it synergizes perfectly well with any kind of leave play ability, whether that's Straken's command squad, or if you want to benefit from on-demand card draw, you can definitely couple this with Captain Marcus to ensure that you're fetching the top 3 cards of your deck, perhaps when you need it the very most. Really, the last thing to mention about this card is that since it has to specifically be affixed to an army unit, just like your Warlord, none of your Guardsman tokens are going to be eligible targets either. Our third card to constitute Colonel Straken's command squad is yet another 1-copy card. It's the 2-cost support Omega Zero Command, with the location trait and reaction. After you win a command struggle, put a Guardsman token into play at that planet, which can potentially be an absolutely incredible effect, or it can absolutely whiff. But this card, perhaps more than any other card we've seen thus far for the Astra Militarum, can be an enormous return on investment. Considering that in any given game there can be up to 25 different command struggles, it is possible, although highly unlikely, maybe more so if your opponent is asleep at their deck, that you can win up to 25 different command struggles over the course of 7 game rounds. And considering that this support can trigger multiple times each round, it doesn't have to exhaust, there's no limit to the number of times per phase or round, this can be an absolutely incredible card. Really, the enormous problem with this is that its value is entirely dependent upon when you draw it. If it's in the first turn or two of the game, it could be incredible. If you end up drawing it on turn 5, 6, or 7, it's very likely that you might see hardly any benefit from this. And it is also important to consider that this is somewhat of a snowball effect. So, for example, the more units you have in play, the more likely you are to win combats, the more you're able to win command struggles. Maybe the more combat units you have in play, the more you can proceed to focus on deploying units to win command struggles. The more you win command struggles, the more resources you get, the more cards you draw, the more tokens you get into play. So, like I mentioned, it's kind of a cyclical snowball type effect that ramps up and becomes exponentially more powerful over time. In some respects, that makes this somewhat of a win more card, where if you're already doing well, if the game is already in your favor and things are looking good, it just further leverages the game and board state in your favor. It probably isn't going to bring you back from a devastating loss, especially if you're already struggling for resources, you have to invest 2 just to play this card, and then that makes it all the less likely that you'll win command struggles, but this could nevertheless make a very big difference in a very close or essentially tied game. And considering that those 1/2 guardsman tokens get another point of attack value if they happen to be at the same planet as Colonel Straken, and when deployed at a planet where there is no enemy warlord, the warlord automatically wins a command struggle, that could potentially be a very powerful effect. And really the last thing to mention for this card is that since the Astra Militarum has plenty of different cards that provide some kind of benefit when units leave play, more guardsman tokens means more triggering events for you to potentially take advantage of all those different effects. Just remember that if the game happens to be going extraordinarily well for you, there is a limit of 10 on the number of tokens any one player can control. Really, the only card that directly synergizes with this is the Engine Seer Augur, an army unit that when it leaves play, it allows you the opportunity to search the top 6 cards of your deck for a 2-cost or lower support and put it directly into play. So if you happen to get lucky, that's fantastic, and if you have your choice of supports, this one is definitely worthy of consideration. Last, but certainly not least, of Straken's signature squad, we have 2 copies of the 1-cost event Glorious Intervention, with 1 shield icon, the tactic trait, and the text Reaction. After a unit is assigned damage by an attack, sacrifice a soldier or warrior unit at the same planet to prevent all of that damage. Then, deal X damage to the attacker. X is the sacrificed unit's printed attack. So this card effectively allows you to give 1 unit's life in order to cancel the damage from 1 attack and to deal that sacrificed unit's attack value worth of damage to the opponent's attacking unit. This is an exceptionally cheap event with an extraordinarily powerful effect, but if for any reason you can't bring yourself to invest that one resource, it does happen to have that one shield icon. Maybe if you have 2 copies of this in your hand, you might want to use this for its shield value, but unless this is going to make all the difference between your opponent being bloodied or not, I can't really see players wanting to give this card up, and really in almost every situation, it makes much more sense to pay that resource and sacrifice a unit, which could be a guardsman token, in order to cancel all damage, not just shield 1, and then deal additional damage in return to the opponent's attacking unit. Just as Colonel Straken himself has an ability that concerns warrior and soldier trait units, like I mentioned before, in addition to the guardsman token, there are 13 different army units in the core set that have either the soldier or warrior trait that an Astra Militarum player might see in their deck, which includes not only Imperial Guard units, but also any non-loyal Orc and Space Marine units as well. And, beyond simply the core set, consider again that throughout the Warlord cycle, we end up seeing 9 more Astra Militarum deck eligible army units that you could potentially target with this card. This card has obvious synergy with Colonel Straken himself in that it could potentially not only cancel a large attack value blow directed to your Warlord, but, depending on where all the involved units are, the army or token unit you choose to sacrifice is likely to have its attack value, and therefore the amount of damage dealt by this event, enhanced by Straken's ability. So, this event not only has potent defensive utility and can pack one hell of a punch in potentially killing opposing units, but it also allows you to control when units leave play. So again, if you happen to have 1 or more copies of the Elysian assault team in your hand that you'd like to deploy into the battlefield, or if you're readying a Cadian Mortar Squad, whatever the effect happens to be that you're taking advantage of that relies on units leaving play, it can allow you to control when exactly you choose to leverage a battle in your favor. Perhaps more so than any other Astra Militarum event, this single card could single-handedly potentially change the outcome of a game-defining or otherwise decisive battle. Although it can really be used in almost any situation, I think it's at its absolute best in longer, more protracted battles, just because if you're able to sacrifice an exhausted unit that's already attacked, it's all the better. I think under absolute ideal conditions, you have Colonel Straken deployed at the planet. You attack with a Straken's command squad early on, it deals 3 damage, maybe your opponent has a large amount of resources invested in some powerful unit like an Ultramarines Dreadnought, so it swings for 8 at Straken, you play this event, you cancel that damage, you sacrifice your exhausted command squad to deal some damage to a target, either wounding a large unit or killing a ready unit that hasn't attacked yet. You're able to play 1 or more assault teams, perhaps trigger some readying effects. As we see the Warlord cycle continue to churn out Orcs, Space Marines, and Astra Militarum cards, there are all the more when this unit leaves play type effects. And as we continue to see more and more expansions, this card is only going to get better and better. Keep in mind, too, that you can also do some very tricky things with this card and play it in a situation where your opponent might be taken completely by surprise. For example, if your opponent has initiative or a ranged unit when you have the initiative token, even if you only have 1 unit at the planet, if it's simply going to get picked off by your enemy, considering that there are 3 steps to resolving a unit taking damage, namely assigning damage tokens, having an opportunity to play a shield card, and then finally taking the damage and placing those damage tokens on a unit which might destroy it, you have an opportunity at that very first step, when you're first assigning, calculating the amount of damage a unit could potentially take, to sacrifice that one unit you have at that planet to kill your opponent's attacking unit before it can do you in. So instead of losing that battle completely one-sided, it allows you to essentially trade with your opponent, which definitely beats losing a unit outright. And like I mentioned before, since that isn't the obvious use of this card, it can really take your opponent by surprise. Really, the only other thing I can think of to mention for this attachment is that it only works in response for an attack. So if your opponent is trying to leverage a lot of area effect army units against you, maybe to kill off your large numbers of swarming army and token units en masse, in that situation, you're not going to be able to respond with this glorious intervention. And because you have to target the attacking unit with that damage, you might want to spend some of your attacks to kill those area effect units, and then reserve this to kill more traditional attackers. But however you choose to use this card, although you are investing an army or token unit, your return on investment for this event could nevertheless pay off in spades. Really, the only other card I can think of to mention to combine with Glorious Intervention might be the attachment Bodyguard, which, if you happen to be taking advantage of that attachment to stockpile damage onto one unit, right before it's about to die, if you've managed to accumulate a large number of wound tokens on it, it makes a lot of sense to choose a heavily injured unit to be the one that you ultimately sacrifice in order to trigger this potentially devastating event. But with that said, that brings our overview and analysis of Colonel Straken and his signature squad to a close. In the future, you'll be able to look forward to a review of all of our other core set Astra Militarum cards, our other Warlords, our other faction core set cards, as well as an in-depth review and analysis of each and every war pack and deluxe expansion that this game either has release or intends to at any point in the future. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. If you'd like to share your own opinion about any of the cards I covered in this video, if you think they're better or worse than I painted them out to be, if you've thought of clever or strategic uses that I haven't thought of, or if you have play experiences with any of these cards that you'd like to share, rules, questions, really anything at all, always feel free to leave a comment. If there's any content you'd like to see coming up from this channel, be sure to let me know. But with that said, thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you again soon.